Okay, the title of this session is Should Younger Woodcraft Members Be Ashamed of the Ideas of Previous Generations of the Folk? This needs some explanation. It arises really because there was a symposium on education for social change, the many histories of the woodcraft folk, September 2018, I think. And I gave a talk at it called Socialism, Eugenics and the Woodcraft Folk in the Interwar Years. And in it, I suggested that the folks' socialist objectives in terms of education were framed within a eugenic understanding of how to bring that about. And it obviously, for people there, it was quite a shocking idea that the folk had been influenced by eugenic ideas in its early years. In particular, a group of DFs asked some questions in the discussion session. One of them said that they'd experienced a crisis of faith upon hearing the talk. Clearly, if you are proud of the tradition of the woodcraft folk and regard that as a tradition to be shared, then it comes as something of a crisis of faith and makes you question whether you should feel rather ashamed of that past. But the other two questions they asked were, how deeply did these ideas penetrate into the movement? And what were we, that is young people in the folk today, supposed to do with this information? And I don't feel that these were adequately answered in the discussion, and probably form part of a useful ongoing debate for the woodcraft folk and for its younger members. So this contribution is intended to take that debate forward a little bit by examining these particular questions. Why a crisis of faith? Well, I think that most people, insofar as they have any knowledge of eugenics, probably associate it with the picture portrays here the victims of the Nazi Holocaust. Eugenic ideas were running through Nazi ideas and led directly to the Holocaust. And many researchers and historians have tracked this since the end of the Second World War and followed through how these eugenic ideas were linked internationally prior to the Second World War. Just to get to grips with what eugenic ideas are, I think three key things. First of all, there's the notion that there are such things as superior and inferior human beings, that some are fit and some are unfit. That these characteristics and traits are inherited, that the superior beings, so long as they mate with similarly superior beings, will produce superior offspring and vice versa. And crucially, that different rates of reproduction amongst these different parts of the population could lead to degeneration of the overall population. And here is a Nazi poster which illustrates this idea, which suggests that if the superior beings have 2 children on average, whilst the inferior beings have 4 children on average, over time this will result in what started off as an even distribution of the 2 types becomes the overwhelming dominance of the inferior type. And it was this idea of degeneration of a race in terms of the Nazi project, or of a national group in other areas, in other parts of the world, which underlies the eugenic ideology. Now, in response to that, eugenic supporters suggested measures to prevent that degeneration occurring. One type of measure could be to encourage the superior beings to reproduce. lesser known about the Nazi eugenic policies were the Lebensborn birth houses, where SS members in particular, but the finer types of the Aryan race, would be encouraged to breed with similarly superior females of the race so as to increase the number of people in that grouping having children. Women were idolized a as a tool, if you like, of reproduction of the superior types. Women's place was firmly in the home, however, and there's an assumption underlying it that it was the male that tended to be the pair, one of the pair that would transmit the superior characteristics. On the other hand, there was negative eugenics, and in the early years of the Nazi regime, this was focused primarily on the abnormal or the mentally deficient child and preventing the reproduction of such people in later life, and sterilization of such people was a major part of the early Nazi eugenic program. Now, just go back one. In Nazi ideology, this was firmly embedded in a racist view of the world. The marriage laws were there to prevent the marriage of Jews to non-Jews, particularly of Aryans to any other inferior race, as they labeled them. And this had a pseudo-scientific rationale to it, in much the same way as apartheid South Africa had to say exactly what category an individual came into, coloured, black, or white. So to the Nazi regime developed a pseudo-scientific approach to showing whether someone was primarily Aryan or primarily Jewish or of some other racial type. Now, in the United States, eugenic ideas were also very popular in the interwar years, and scholars have shown how it'd be a mistake to simply see the form that eugenics took in the Nazi regime as the only reactionary form of this ideology. Here on the bottom right, this is a show to promote eugenic ideas. And in the bottom right, you can see a chart, again, pseudo-scientific comparison. Notice the categories. There's the native-born American, there is the foreign-born American, and there is the Negro. They were very concerned with immigration and also very concerned to assert the superiority of whites over the Negro population. And they never questioned whether any of these differences in literacy might be to do with social or economic factors, but assumed that these were inherited characteristics. Probably the main form this took in terms of winning changes in public policy were the sterilization of the deficient, particularly the mentally deficient sections of the population. And this chart shows the different states in which there were either eugenical sterilization laws carried through, or they were in the process of being discussed in the year of 1935. There was a positive eugenics in the United States as well. This is a picture of again, one of the promotional booths of the eugenics movement, where a fittest family competition has taken place. Noticeably, these are all white people, and they are celebrating the winners of the fittest family as if it were comparable, one family to another, to make criterion of who was fit and who was not. In Britain, the emphasis tended to be more on social class. There's still the same basic method as this poster from the 1930s shows. Only healthy seed must be sown. Check the seeds of the hereditary disease and unfitness by eugenics. In the end of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th century, up to the First World War, this was posed very much in terms of social class, with the assumption that the superior beings were to be found in the middle classes. So a common policy change advocated by eugenists was that there should be tax breaks for middle class families, because they were tending to have less children, and that would encourage them to have larger families to pay for private education and so on. On the other hand, the negative eugenics was to promote family planning education for the working class women of the East End in particular, who was seen as the most degenerate of the social classes. And of course, again, as in the United States, a major campaign that in the 1930s reached fairly broad sections of the population was that for compulsory sterilization for what was termed the mentally deficient, to prevent their breeding. Now, how does this relate to the folk? On the one hand, the folk saw itself as developing socialist ideas and having the aim of bringing about socialist change. This is from a little pamphlet produced for children by the Woodcraft folk called Who's for the Folk. The Woodcraft folk seeks to establish a new social order. They believe that when the worker achieves freedom from wage slavery, the end of capitalism, and the fruits of toil are garnered by the toilers, socialism, then will a new stage of development open out to man, a new epoch rich in promise of a finer social life and a great awakening of intellect. Some form of cooperative commonwealth in which poverty is vanished may well mean not the end, but the beginning of the evolution of man. So the folks' idea was somehow that this contribution was towards the further evolution of man as a species. At the end of this little pamphlet, introduced by Little Otter, Leslie Paul, says the race wants individuals, real men and women divorced from the mass emotion that sways this way and that. The race needs beings who are prepared to stake their lives that the evolving may go forward and the rot that is civilization may be stayed. And in the Woodcraft folk movement, you will find vigorous men and women, sunburnt youths and maidens, and energetic boys and girls who are living simply and thinking keenly, and who have not mistaken slavery to the machine for human progress. Are you fit? Are you vital? Have you the courage to join us in our task? And it ends with a slogan that was very common to the folk in the 20s and early 30s. You can't build an A1 Commonwealth from C3 people. Degeneracy, Leslie Paul told us in the Folk Trail in 1925, spreads until the race finds itself without the vitality to combat it. Even if any crusade against unfitness on a national scale is not possible, it is urgent that the folk attempt to build a new caste of supple-bodied and vigorous-minded people who shall be worthy of the future. This view of positive eugenics lay behind the Woodcraft folks' approach by raising children as vigorous in mind, fit in mind and body. It was assumed that a kind of natural eugenics, positive eugenics would take place, that these fit in mind and body would seek mates who were similarly fit in mind and body. And I think this was peppered through the culture of the Woodcraft folk, and this is just one example, the Woodcraft wedding, which, okay, you may say that when people are involved in an organization and share common values and a common outlook and common activities, they will tend to form relationships and partnerships. And isn't this true of the folk today? But I think it depends upon what framework that is celebrated in the case of the Woodcraft folk. So how far did these eugenic ideas permeate the folk as a movement? Let's try and pare this down a little bit. Was the folk racist? Well, I've come across a couple of examples in the archives of this period that show there were existent racist attitudes on the part of some members of the folk, and sometimes when these were raised, these were not challenged within the folk. But more importantly, was this a systematic part of the woodcraft folks' art ideology? Was it a necessary component of their eugenic view of how to bring about socialism? I'm not convinced of this. I can't find a trace, for example, of the anti-Semitism that was present in Britain as well as in other European countries, and was not the sole preserve of the Nazis at all. You can find the odd statement in relation, as I said, to black people, but not in relation to Jews at that particular time. I don't think it formed an essential part of the ideology, and it was more concerned with class than it was with any notion of superior or inferior races. So was it classist? Well, it was in a sort of funny way, because unlike the mainstream of eugenics, who essentially saw the middle class as the superior, the concern of the woodcraft folk was developing within the working class a caste of hardyhoods that was capable of leading and bringing about socialist change. So it's kind of inverted classist approach, if you like. Was it elitist? Well, there I think you can certainly say that it was. Here's a quote from the correspondence course of 1930. Backward, mentally deficient and unfit children should not be enrolled in a group. They need special attention and organisation you cannot afford to give. Now, that phrase there, you could think, well, okay, we're an organisation of volunteers. Even today, it's very difficult to enrol children with physical disabilities or with autism. We don't have the skills, we don't have the finances, we don't have the resources. It's very difficult to cope with those children that require special attention and organisation. But see how it goes on. Please note that for the health of the children who are whole, they should never be included in a group, no matter what personal plea. Experience shows that viciousness and sexual irresponsibility goes hand with MD, that's mental deficiency, and sometimes venereal disease as well. You cannot take too many precautions to protect children from association with people who are irresponsible or abnormal in any way. Clearly elitist, as one person at the symposium said, this might rule out most of the people on our table. Now, there's another element of it, however, that caused quite a lot of consternation and debate, and that is the way in which these supple-bodied and fit-minded young people would be trained. Because the woodcraft folk put great emphasis on what it called tribal training and the pursuit of the primitive. And they took many of these ideas about how to do this from Ernest Seton Thompson, the American naturalist and founder of the American Woodcraft Indians. And you can see at the top there the ceremony of the lighting of the fire dance, but also the kind of symbolism of the publications. The one at the bottom just shows a teepee, a totem pole, a walking stick, a drum. You know, the idea of the Native American Indians' way of life was the framework in which tribal training in the folk would take place, producing people fit in mind and body. Now, these ideas included the endorsement of a theory of the psychologist Stanley Hall. And basically, Stanley Hall saw child development as taking place through stages. These stages reflected the stages in the evolution of man, starting with the Stone Age man, the hunter and gatherer, through to the Neolithic Revolution. This is going up the page on the left. The Neolithic Revolution and agriculture through to industrial society of the 19th and 20th century. Now, Stanley Hall assumed that this hierarchy of development also was related to a hierarchy of superiority and inferiority of these stages of human development. That people who had a nomadic hunter-gatherer way of life, such as the Australian Aborigine, were at a lower place on the scale from those that, like the plainsmen of the North American plains, the hunter-gatherers or other cultures, and the highest form of civilization was the industrialized world. And of course, there was an implicit racism in this, that it was the white populations of the industrial world that were above the non-white populations in terms of evolution and development. Now, the Woodcraft folk took this theory of recapitulation, as it was called, child development, and it utilized the American Indian as the representative of the primitive through which children must go if they are to fully develop. Now, in the debate in the Woodcraft folk, this has often been, this utilization of the Native American ways has often been seen as something comparable to blacking up. Blacking up being the way in which white people would color themselves with black ointment in order to essentially misrepresent black people, to make fun of or to give a particular stereotype of what black people were. Similar to the image on the right there from an American film, where stereotypical images of black people as happy, joyful, singing, dancing, but not particularly smart, they were commonplace in the media. And the black and white minstrel show in British television when I was a kid kind of reflected that. Blacking up, therefore, is a kind of way of poking fun at and appropriates aspects of that culture, such as the singing of spirituals and so on, as part of that stereotypical representation of a population. But is this something that the folk was doing through its Red Indianism, as I prefer to call it? Now, the cultural appropriation concept, I find a little difficult, I have to confess. But given that it's been raised in the folk, let's look at it a little bit more. Is it cultural appreciation or a cultural appropriation that the folk was engaged in? You see, Edward Seton Thompson and the folk not only identified with the ways of the Native American, but also saw them as the victims of oppression and genocide as a consequence of white colonization of the United States. It was not so much to downplay the culture of the Native American as to idealize it. And in fact, where you start to get the problems is that it was an idealized view of Native American culture, something informed by white Caucasian ideas about Native American culture, a kind of idealization that in the case of Thompson and others saw Native American culture as actually more advanced than the culture of the white civilization. So it was by no means clear cut. The idealized, the uninformed element makes it patronizing. That's certainly true, but it's not the same quite, I don't think, as blacking up. It would have been more problematic had the folk claimed to be representative of or to speak for that culture. Certainly, Ernest Seton Thompson tended to do this, and there were people who engaged in the UK in what was called, hobbyists of Native American culture, who tended to present themselves as authorities able to speak on behalf of the Native American. I suppose more to the point is the mimicking of supposed aspects of that culture when you're utilizing them for very different purposes. For the folk, they saw this as allowing children to go through a necessary stage of the primitive in order to develop as the best human beings. It's kind of it's a mimicking which, on the one hand, pays compliment to Native American culture, but on the other hand, is kind of misutilizing that representation of the culture for its own purposes. So, for me, cultural appropriation, it's an ambiguous concept when trying to understand the folk. Should we feel ashamed of the early folk? Well, one of the things that was said, and I said at the symposium, was eugenic ideas were widely held at the time. You know, the folk wasn't alone in this, and it certainly wasn't the originator of those ideas or the propagandist for those ideas. It was a recipient of those ideas. But that's not to say that it's a valid excuse just because many people were racist or many people were sexist. Doesn't mean that that makes it okay. More importantly, I think, though, is how were they able to move beyond those eugenic ideas? Because one of the things about the folk is that they did that before the Second World War. They did it in the 1930s, before the Holocaust took place, and before the exposures of the logical extent of Nazi ideology in the form of the Holocaust. Part of the reason for that was the influence of the Socialist Educational International, which they became a part of in the mid-30s. And that, to me, is important. That is something where, okay, there's the negative side of the early woodcraft folk, but the ability to move beyond it and to adopt a different approach to education for social change, one not tainted by eugenics, says something about the organisation. And I would argue that this was partly in response to its young members, and that similar changes have taken place in the folk in subsequent years, tackling racism in society, tackling sexism within society and within their own organisation, as with racism, tackling gay rights and homophobia, very often have come from the younger members of the organisation, in particular youth inside the organisation. So, okay, we may not feel entirely comfortable with the folks' early beginnings, but there is something there that is different to simply trailing behind the dominant views in society, and an ability to think through and change their views as a consequence of their attempts to bring about socialist change. And they weren't perfect in that, but then, you know, why are we feeling ashamed of the early folk any more than we're feeling ashamed of other aspects of the history of the UK? So what are we supposed to do with this information? I think I want to use to finish a quote from Leslie Paul. So it comes about that our principles of training permeate the whole of our activities. This is talking about the 1920s. Every symbol, every totem, every song has its own peculiar value. And no action from acting a charade to boiling a billy, cooking pot of water, is devoid of significance. Now, Leslie Paul meant that literally. You know, totems were part of the Red Indianism, the symbols were part of it, the songs from socialist songs through to folk songs to songs about how the woodcraft girl would be loving the woodcraft man and vice versa. They all had their significance within that kind of eugenically informed approach. But no action from acting a charade to boiling a billy of water is devoid of significance. These two he saw as part of the educational approach. Now, if that's true, and I think there's an element of truth, strong element of truth in that when it comes to the woodcraft folk being for education for social change, then what significance do we place on the way we go about choosing our charades and acting out our charades today? What significance do we place on the totems of the 1960s, for example, and the, I think, largely absence of totems of today? What significance do we place on the boiling of a billy? Is this something that an individual carries out? Is this something that is involving a collection of wood by a group of people? Are these methods of assembling the fire a necessary part of education in the woodcraft folk? What I'm getting at here is, if we're trying to practice education for social change today, then surely looking at how this was approached in the past can only help us reflect on what we're doing today. I don't just mean in the broad camera or broad spread of what we're doing today, but I mean even down to little details. Why have we got this song in the phone book, in the songbook today? Where does it come from, and what role does it play in helping the education for social change of today? So that, to me, rather than feeling guilty about the past, or certainly not trying to rewrite the past or ignore the past, but actually examining the past in order to help us in the present, help us reflect and become better at what we're doing now. And if anyone's interested in any of this stuff about the 1920s and 30s, my talk at the symposium is at that website, mediacentral.ucl.ac.uk/play/14091. And also located on those web pages is the discussion that took place afterwards. And my book on education for social change in the interwar years is available on Kindle or from Amazon. Okay, that's it. I hope it's useful. I'd be glad to hear any comments on it.